Do you frequently feel like other people are being critical of you? Do you often take things way too personally? Welcome to the Transformational Peace Podcast, and I'm Dr. Lee. In this episode, we will talk about why we take things so personally and how it affects our relationships. And thank you for clicking on this video, and if it provides you with encouragement, please click the subscribe or follow button below. Also, please share this video with someone you feel might find this information helpful. Hello, friends. Thanks for joining me. And today we'll be discussing how to stop taking things so personally, mastering emotional resilience. Taking things personally or personalizing is a common phenomenon that can stem from a variety of factors. When we invest emotionally in a situation or relationship, criticism or perceived slights can trigger a defensive reaction. Personal insecurities, past experiences, and a desire for validation can also contribute to taking things personally. And honestly, if we take things personally, especially if they're not personal, this could be an indication that something has hit a nerve. Understanding why we take things personally involves recognizing the complexities of human emotions and interactions. So in this video, I'm going to talk about three important areas as they relate to taking things personally. First, I'm going to discuss some of the reasons why we take things personally. And second, I'm going to talk about some signs that you may be taking things personally in your interactions with others. And third, I'm going to make two recommendations at the end of the video to learn how to begin to not take things personally. So first, let's talk about what causes us to take things personally and why we perpetuate this cycle. Believe it or not, when we begin the process of taking things personally, we're basically projecting our own doubts and insecurities onto other people. In other words, we subconsciously need other people to dislike what we don't like about ourselves. And I know this sounds strange, however, as we have these moments of taking things personally or reading more into the situation and further worrying and obsessing about it, we're trying to create ways to understand what we imagine we've done wrong. And what this really amounts to is a defensive strategy. For example, we take things personally, we become offended, and then we defend ourselves and worry and obsess over what we might have done wrong. The end result of this is that our defense mechanisms are triggered and we enter into a stress response or possibly hyperarousal, and our body begins to become flooded with adrenaline and cortisol. Remember, think stress hormones. Our fight, flight, or freeze response kicks in, and usually our fight defense begins, hence our being offended or going on defense to protect ourselves. Now, hopefully, most of you aren't completely confused. However, I think you can begin to see some of the patterns here. And in the interest of what I've just explained, I'll go to the second part of this video where we'll look at some of the signs or examples that we see when we take things personally. And as you're listening to the signs, try to see if you can identify some of the patterns you might see in your own life. So here are some signs that you might be taking things personally. We often find ourselves becoming defensive in ordinary or even casual conversations with others. This is important, especially if this is someone we've just met or we don't know very well, and honestly, our defensiveness confuses them. Or maybe it's someone we do know well, and in conversation they criticize us, and we immediately go into a defensive posture and begin explaining ourselves. The important point here is, in either scenario, our response is one of defensiveness. And number two, we take things personally when the situation or interaction has absolutely nothing to do with us. And honestly, this is one I see the most often. We've all had this experience where we text someone and we don't hear back from them right away or even at all. And what we do next is we begin to imagine the worst case scenario, like, are they being rude to us or did we do something to offend them? Usually, we often find out later that their phone died or maybe they were just away from their phone. And the amazing part about this, when we hear that it's not about us, we suddenly feel okay. And I also see this in situations with our friends we know somewhat well. When our experience with them is typically gone reasonably well, it's that one fine day where they're maybe a little short with us or they're not as friendly. Often we immediately begin wondering, what did I do wrong? Or maybe they aren't interested in being my friend anymore, only to find out later that they had a family emergency. And again, we suddenly feel relieved and okay. I'm reminded of an example I saw on YouTube recently. It was a young man, probably in his early 30s, and he had gone out on a first date with a girl he'd met online. And as he talked further, he described in detail what he believed was a pretty good first date. I think he said they met for lunch. And as the date ended and feeling like things had gone well, he told her that he would call or text her sometime the next week to set up another date. And according to him, she seemed to be pretty chill with the idea. So later the following week, he tried to call her and she didn't answer, so he left her a voice message. So a few more days went by and he began to get a little anxious and worried. He actually wondered out loud in the video if it was something he did or said. And at one point, he became so concerned, he began texting her, and he continued to text her, unfortunately. After a few days, he explained in the video, she actually did call back and apologized and stated that she had had a last-minute deadline and had been working late and hadn't been able to get back with him. And this is where things went downhill quickly. While clearly being apologetic and stating her reasons for not calling, she also let him know that his texting frequently was a bit much for her, as well as confusing, and she wasn't interested in any future dates. Oddly enough, or at least in the video, he seemed angry. Clearly, this is a good example of taking things personally when her situation, not getting back to him, had nothing to do with him. And number 3, we take things personally when we spend a lot of time ruminating about social situations. Ruminating is worrying about past or perceived mistakes or possible criticism we may have received from others. Rumination can also be an obsessive thought or mental looping or thought loop where we dwell on the past in a negative or emotionally distressing way, and this is a somewhat common occurrence. Check out my video on overthinking, which goes more into depth on rumination. When we ruminate, especially in terms of taking things too personally, we become trapped in a whirlpool of guilt and regrets. With this obsession of the past and perceived mistakes, we often struggle with the blame game, and unfortunately, this turns into, am I responsible or is the other person responsible for what is happening? And often we tend to err on the side of blaming ourselves. So now we understand 3 basic signs of where we may be taking things personally. And before we get to the recommendations, let's talk practically about what's really going on when we take things personally. Our life stories tend to revolve around ourselves and oftentimes our fragile egos. This is called being egocentric. And what we need to understand is that not everything is about us. I know, right? We also need to realize that people attack other people because they're insecure. And yes, we fall into that group at times. We need to be honest with ourselves and realize that we rarely have evidence to believe that others are a threat to us. And yes, I understand that there are times when there are actual safety or security issues. So let me give an example here. If I were being critical of you and I said, "Oh, you're such a marshmallow," would you be upset? Probably not. However, if I were being critical of you and I said, "Geez, you're such a pathetic moron," would you be upset? Absolutely. So help me understand what the difference is here, and honestly, there isn't one. The only difference is the derogatory meaning and the insecure value we attach to it. In other words, we were offended by the critical derogatory remark because we believed it to be true and gave value and meaning to it. So basically, we take things personally because we're insecure. And the best thing we can do for ourselves is to take the energy we're using to be insecure and put it towards building a strong foundation of self-worth. Okay, now part 3 of this video, and now I'm going to make 2 good recommendations to help us try to learn how to not take things personally. And number 1. So the first recommendation is in 2 parts. So the first part is to get 2 pieces of paper. On the first sheet of paper, write down all the things that are within our control. On the second sheet of paper, write down all the things that aren't within our control. And here's the fun part. Take the second sheet of paper with the things that we can't control, crumple it up and throw it away. We don't need it. Remember, our only concern is what is within our control. And the second part is to set boundaries to better manage what is within our control. Look at the piece of paper of things that are within our control and exercise better boundaries of things we can control and choose to control. Personal or self-boundaries are our responsibility. We choose what is and isn't acceptable in our lives. We have to know where the other person ends and we begin. If the person we're talking to is insecure and we feel attacked, try to remember that insecure people attack other people. Keep your boundaries firm and don't try to change their boundaries. Don't try to tell them what they should be doing. Simply let them know our boundaries and what does and doesn't work for us. And number 2, we need to set standards for ourselves that are clear and attainable. If you're feeling somewhat insecure in a conversation, ask for clarification if you're not sure about someone's intentions. And as you're listening, take time to clarify and ask yourself, do I need to do something about this now or should I let it go? We need to avoid attaching meaning to something that may not have anything to do with us. Remember, our internal sense of security comes from becoming the person we want to be. Be certain of who you are such that you don't need the approval of others. Doing this helps us with our inner voice that is telling us that we are not good enough. And while we're doing this, we need to be kind and compassionate with ourselves. We need to tell ourselves that we are doing our best and that's all we can ask of ourselves. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope that by watching, all of us were encouraged and feel more equipped to better deal with ourselves when we notice that we're beginning to take things too personally. And remember, you'll never become who you want to be if you're attached to who you've been. Grace and peace unto you. I'm Dr. Lee.